Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Truth C Squared podcast. My name is Shmez, and I'm joined with my good friend and host, Colin Carlson. Colin, what's up?
Hey,
I can
bro.
barely hear you.
Hey,
Oh my god, you're so laggy. Try one more time.
hey.
Okay. Well, hopefully that doesn't stay an issue. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to explain the name of the podcast real quick, which kind of explains the whole purpose and goal of what we're trying to do here. So truth c squared, it's sort of just a math equation like x c squared, and we're just trying to find the value of x, which in our case is truth. And truth is being modified by c, and that stands for me and Colton. And the squared part is just us interacting with it. So essentially, it's truth being modified and interacted with by us, which I think uh, truth is modified in a small or big degree depending on the independent values that we bring to it. And the goal is to make that as small as possible so that the value of truth is accurate. Um, and then the squared part, you can think of it as us trying to explain our understanding of truth, and then it's also how you receive that info. So it's our thoughts expressed through words aren't always going to be a perfect transfer of information. And you, as the listener, won't always receive it perfectly either. So some of our information that we're putting out is going to be modified or lost in translation when other people are listening to it. Um, and we also think that truth has sort of an infinite value, like the digit pi. You can think of it like that. We can get pretty far into the sequence, but eventually it's almost impossible to know exactly what the next digit is. So our goal is to get as far along in there as we can, but with the understanding that it's kind of an impossible goal to reach, although we can be very accurate, I think. So with that, we are going to spend the first episode talking about ourselves. We need to explain to you guys what that C value is, what we're bringing to the equation. So I understand a lot of people probably won't care too much, and I don't blame them. So feel free to just, at this point, skip this entire episode if you don't want to hear us talk about ourselves. And then in the second episode, we're actually going to get into some philosophy and some different stuff that Colton and I have been working on for the past few months. So with that, let's get started talking about ourselves. So Colton, we're going to start with you. I already have some questions that we're going to answer. And the goal here is not just to give you guys information about ourselves. We're trying to kind of express ourselves as accurately as possible to you so that some of the stuff we say is going to make sense based on, you know, what you understand about us. So hopefully it'll make more sense as we go along further with this. But to start it off, Colton, we just need some basic info from you. What's your job? Where'd you graduate? And where'd you go to high school?
Yeah, so can you hear me? Is it all
Yeah,
good right
yeah,
now?
you're good.
So I'm a high school math teacher and a high school philosophy teacher, and I teach in Arizona. I've been teaching for about 5 years down there. Graduated with a bachelor's in theology and a bachelor's in math education. So I know a lot of theology, but not nearly as much as I would want. But I use a lot of that theology to impact my philosophy. I graduated at CSU or Clark Summit University near Scranton, Pennsylvania. It's a really small college. So the same high school together, Papillion Vista
Hmm.
South. That was in small town. I don't think it's really small anymore.
It's not. It's the outskirts of Omaha, Papillion,
Yeah, it's
Nebraska.
yeah, Papillion, Nebraska. It's about south of Omaha. It was a freaking great town. I love it.
Hmm.
The high school is state of the art. I mean, a bomb high school. I do not regret that experience going there. So that's where I went to college, high school, and that's my job.
Yeah. So with that, we both went to that high school, and I guess I should probably explain this to the audience that me and Colton pretty much grew up together from the time I was 2 years old. we went to the same church together. So we were like nursery buddies, and then went to that church all the way up until we graduated and left and went to college. And when before I went into junior high, we actually moved into the same school district as Colton. We went from Millard to Papillion, so we went to junior high and high school together, and we also worked the same job, which is right across the street from Colton's house. So I was always hanging out with Colton after school and after work and on weekends, and pretty much all my free time we were hanging out. Like, I mean, pretty much our entire lives. So we're super close. I would consider him my brother. Um, so with that, I went to college at Grace University. I guess I'll get the school stuff out of the way real quick. I did not graduate though. I only went for I think it was 3 years, and I started in the teaching program. I also wanted to be a teacher for English, but then I switched to it was ancient Near East studies, a humanities degree with a focus on ancient language and literature. And I was only into that for like a year or a year and a half until I had to go on a medical leave because I got really sick. And as I was coming back from that and was eligible to go back to school is when Grace University closed. So I did not go back after that to college in any capacity. I was about to have my first kid, and I was still dealing with health problems. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to even go to school, even if I had that opportunity. And since then, I just haven't really had the want to go back to college. And that was, I think, like 4 or 5 years ago now. So, um, but right now I'm working as administration specialist in the supply chain at Nebraska Furniture Mart. I've been working at Nebraska Furniture Mart for the last 5 years in a lot of different jobs. And the one I'm doing right now is basically working with vendors to make sure that the information coming in about stuff we're receiving is accurate and orders are accurate and all that good stuff. So really boring desk job, but I love that company. I love working for them. I have a great boss and great people I work with. So yeah, not very exciting. It's just kind of a normal average job. So yeah, I wanted to move on, get that basic information out of the way. I wanted to know, Colton, what is your religious views? We'll start with that. What's your religious views?
So, well, I grew up, as you did, Baptist,
Mm-hmm.
the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches, or GARB. Went to camp with GARB churches and everything. So I grew up around the Baptist denomination, the Baptist doctrine of baptism, and their they structure the church and so forth. And it's okay. I think I have great respect for a lot of Baptists, and especially the Southern Baptist convention. But right now, I'm currently a Presbyterian, and even more of a subset of that, I would consider myself a Reformed Calvinist Protestant. So Protestant, I'm Reformed, which means I adhere to the same doctrines as Martin Luther, John Calvin, Beza, the Westminster Confession from the 1500s and 1600s during the Protestant Reformation. And that's usually where they get the name Calvinist, from the Synod of Dort. So boring history stuff, but that's when I was going through my degree, I studied a lot of that, and it was very systematic, very robust. And then when we moved down to AZ, Arizona, we found a Presbyterian church, and I think it's even more systematic than the Baptist. I think they make a lot more sense when it comes to how they approach interpretation. So I'm that a
Okay.
Reformed Calvinist.
I would consider myself a pragmatic Christian. That's pretty much it. The church I go to, we're non-denominational. It was a former Garb church, but they cut ties with them and dropped the Baptist name. So, like you, I also grew up very Baptist, very conservative, like almost 1800s, early 1900s style church with hymnals and no dancing, no dating, all that good stuff. But since then, like all the churches I've gone to have been non-denominational, and that's kind of where I'm comfortable with it. Um, so, but if you want more detailed, like I would also consider myself a Calvinist. I'm not very educated on what all that means. Although all the conversations I've had with Colton over the last couple of months has kind of changed me from really somebody who didn't care and think it was that important, um, to somebody, I guess, who believes in it. And I agree with a lot of what Colton's taught me. So I guess I am a non denominational Christian Calvinist, I suppose. So with that, I did want to explain. So basically, we're saying we're Christian. That's kind of a big part of our worldview. We've been in the church since as long as we can remember. It's always been a part of our life, and it's pretty much stayed that way our entire life. I don't think at any point either of us walked away from the faith or away from church or anything like that. So I wanted to explain to you guys real quick how we got saved. Um, at least it was significant for me. For Colton, probably less so. But for me, I got saved when I was like 3 years old, or not even, almost turning three. And I guess you need a little bit of background information. My early childhood was very rough. I was a foster child. I was in foster care from I think it was a year old to 2 years old when I went to my first home, and I stayed there um, throughout my childhood with the same foster parents. So I pretty much grew up with a normal, knowing both my parents, or had two parents in the household through foster care. But before that was really rough. Like my mom was a drug addict and had a lot of issues there. And I didn't know my dad, and my brother, my half brother, his dad was super abusive, and my mom was kind of getting away from him. So we were put in foster care not because she thought she was good, being a bad parent, or thought, there was better for us out there. We went into foster care because we were on the verge of dying. So that's how bad it got. But through that whole time, my earliest memories were just feeling of safety and security from some type of imaginary friend type of figure. It wasn't that sophisticated because I was so young, but I remember feeling taken care of, even though the adults around me weren't taking care of me. So when I went to church, I remember hearing about the Sermon on the Mount and this guy, Jesus, preaching. And right when I heard that name, it just clicked in my head instantly. And I don't know why, but I was like, oh, Jesus, that's the name of the guy who's been taking care of me. And it just instantly like made sense to me. So in a way, I've always felt like a Christian, or felt saved in a sense. Um, I went home that night, and my mom wanted me to, do the little prayer thing and repeat after me so you can be saved. And I didn't really want to do it. And after getting whooped by a belt for a while, I heard a still small voice, I guess you could call it, saying like, just say the prayer, say, what you need to get her off your back, and I'll take care of everything else. Don't worry about it. And that was one of the first times I felt like I heard the voice of God. And I've had that happen to me a few times throughout my life, but that was obviously the most significant that I can remember. And all of this stuff, very well could have been just the overactive imagination of an abused child, which I wouldn't disagree with you there. I'm not saying God himself spoke to me, but that's what it felt like to me. Um, so I remember just saying the prayer, going into my room and laying down, crying myself to sleep because I was so upset about the whole thing. And I, at no point in my life have felt like, changing my mind about it, or felt like I didn't believe in it anymore. It's always been kind of a cornerstone of who I am, I suppose. So not fun, um, but it was really significant and formed me as a person. So I was one of those people that didn't feel like I decided to get saved or thought about it and came to some logical conclusion. I felt like I was called and chosen by God to be saved. And that might sound arrogant, but I don't think there's any other way to describe it. Nothing about my salvation story was logical or well thought out. I mean, I was a child, so I will leave it at that. Colton, did you want to share anything about how you got saved?
Well, I said growing up in a Baptist church, the sinner's prayer is probably the number one way
Yeah.
you become saved. So I was, saved at 6 years old, but not because I cared about Jesus or I wanted a relationship or I heard the gospel and I was like, dang, like he loves me that much, like I'm gonna follow him. It was none of that. I just didn't
Mm-hmm.
want to go to hell. That's all it was. I heard hell and I was like, crap, I don't want to burn alive. So like what 6 year old does, I mean, in a sense, it's kind of traumatizing,
Yeah.
maybe child abuse in some way, but it's like, but if you say this prayer, you don't have to. So I was like, well, heck yeah, count me in, let's go. It was scheduled. Like it was a scheduled thing with Pastor Jones, if you remember.
Yeah.
Uh, so I remember him talking about a gift and how you can, the gift is freely taken and it's up to you how you do that gift, how you, I don't know,
Receive it. It's up to
receive
you to
it.
receive it, to
Up to you
accept
that
it.
receive it, but it's also up to you how you use it after you receive it. So he
Mm-hmm.
basically had an illustration of like a $1 bill, and I can give this $1 bill to you, and you're richer because I give it to you. Uh, but it's up to you how you spend it, and you can
Mm-hmm.
waste it or you can save it for eternity, or something along those lines. Of course, like I'm traumatized, so I say, "Well, give me the freaking dollar bill." So give me the dollar bill. I believe.
Yeah.
And it was great. Like I knew I was part of a Christian family and I wanted to be Christian, but I never knew what it was to be Christian. And I was a really, jerk to you, jerk to my parents growing up, a jerk to any other friend, really. I was just a nasty kind of kid. Although I wasn't nasty, nasty, I wasn't like juvenile, but I was just not necessarily a pleasant boy, I guess, to be around. I was kind of sharp around the edges sometimes. And I never knew that was because of my sin. It wasn't until 15 over, I'm not going to dive into the details there, over a period of events or a sequence of events. When I was 15, I was kind of woken up by God saying, like, this is serious. And it wasn't like I was afraid of hell. It was more like, it is serious. God did die for me, and I want to know more about him. I never knew why. I never knew why I wanted to know more about him. I never knew why I wanted to learn about Christ or pay attention instead of sleeping during the sermons or actually wanting to memorize verses to actually battle the spiritual warfare hitting me. Like I never knew why I wanted to do that until a couple months later. I just started dawning on me after listening to a couple of sermons and reading a couple of books when I was 15 that man, I'm probably saved, but I wasn't before. So I'm not necessarily sure. I didn't necessarily have the same moment as Shemez did. When it came down to it, it was just somewhere in February of 2010. That's pretty much what it was.
Somewhere
Somewhere
around
in
there.
February 2010, somewhere around that month, maybe even March. I don't know, but it wasn't an exact moment. I just knew that my desires has changed
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to know who God was. And I was get into this in a little bit, but I was almost irresistibly called. Like I didn't not want to serve him. I wanted to serve him, and it was a genuine service
Yeah.
instead of instead of like not wanting to be in hell. And that's why I'm going to serve. Christ wasn't a bonus; he was the gift.
Yeah.
Instead of heaven being the gift. And I think that really impacted me in a variety of ways. Impacted me, my family, where I went to college. So that's basics of how I
So
got
you can
saved.
see a common theme there was that we both felt called or irresistibly drawn. Um, so take that for what it's worth. But you see similarities.
Sure.
Next
Yeah.
question. I want to know what has been or who has been the biggest influence on your worldview. And this is going to be religious, but also just general worldview?
Yeah. It's a tough question.
Yeah.
Thinking about it. So I thought about it. I kind of added to it a couple of times, but I have to say for you first. I mean, I remember in your little townhouse during our senior year, when I was so legalistic on so many different ways, you wouldn't even let me get by. Like,
No.
you would just like pound it in me, be like, "What's your problem?" Like, "No, let's talk about this." Like, um, and I wasn't necessarily thankful at the time, but after going to college and after thinking like about it, and studying what you're talking to me about, it wasn't crazy. It was probably even more biblical than what I was doing. And so, and it was actually more freeing. And so, this idea of getting away from legalism, I think, is one of the biggest impacts you've given me, besides just general friendship and brotherhood. Um, so,
Well,
yeah, I would
that's
say,
nice. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I would say you. So many different reasons. We could have a whole podcast episode on just you and me, but um, how we help each other. But other people, I guess, in college. So I remember there's this kid in my tenth grade, sophomore year, beginning of my sophomore year, or maybe even the last semester of my freshman year. Came in and he started talking to me about this thing called Calvinism, and I was like, "What is that?" And I was really against it because I was like, "No, Christ died for all men." And if we're going to get into the definitions of Calvinism in the next episode, but uh, this idea of Calvinism is one of the main tenets is Christ dying for just the select few, specifically the elect. And I was like, this is heresy. This is ridiculous. And he just was very calm the whole time. He answered my questions. He showed me exegetically in the scriptures how that just isn't really consistent with what the systematic of the scriptures is as we take the Bible as a whole. And it was just very enlightening. And so I started listening to this guy who was his favorite preacher at the time. His name was Paul Washer, and he's still alive. He was a missionary to Chile, I believe, and in Peru. And he runs a missionary organization called Heart Cry Ministries. Paul Washer is amazing. He was actually popular from one sermon, and it's called the Shocking Youth Message. And you can just Google it, YouTube it, the Shocking Youth Message, Paul Washer, and it's a fantastic message. I've never heard preaching like this before. It was almost like actual preaching to the soul of the individual. Like, it wasn't just like an amen, like, keep preaching it, brother. It wasn't that. It was like, I'm actually talking about you. You are in sin. You need to get out of sin. It was very powerful as a young college student to listen to. And throughout listening to many of his sermons, he really influenced me to Calvinism and the power of the gospel and overcoming sin, as well as Spurgeon. Everyone pretty much knows Spurgeon, the Prince
Yeah.
of Preachers. So Spurgeon was, Paul Washer was influenced by Spurgeon. So I started picking up some of Spurgeon's books, reading him, and just Reformed tradition as a whole. It was very impactful to me in my struggle over sin. I felt as if Calvinism and its systematic provided the best sort of sanctification that I could receive better than my non-Calvinist roots. So, um, throughout my years in college, I started listening to other Calvinists like John Piper. He wrote an amazing book I think every Christian should read, even if they disagree with Calvinism, called Desiring God. And it's basically Christian. It's a claim on what he calls Christian hedonism. So it's not the case that you just follow God because you have to. You follow God because you want to. How do you want to follow God? Like, how is that possible? Well, it's his mantra. His mantra is simply this: God is most glorified in us, and we are most satisfied in him. So basically, John Piper's like, these two things aren't antithetical to each other. They're not mutually exclusive. In other words, they overlap. You don't need to sacrifice you being satisfied, God being glorified. They're one and the same thing. And oftentimes, at least for me, when I felt my Christian life, I felt as if I'm either satisfied or not. But when I'm not satisfied, God is glorified. But when God is not glorified, I'm satisfied. That's just not the case. God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. There is a satisfaction that can be found most pleasurable when we glorify Him. So this impacted me.
Mm-hmm.
As I graduated and started getting into philosophy and everything, another Calvinist, he's not a theologian, but he's a Calvinist philosopher, Guillaume Bignon, the French Calvinist philosopher. And he was actually atheist for most of his life. And he actually he had another similar testimony. You can actually Google it or YouTube it, Guillaume Bignon testimony. And uh, it's a very powerful testimony. It's almost exactly like ours, Shemez. It's kind of irresistible. Like when he explains it, it's very powerful. And now he's one of the most prominent Calvinist philosophers, probably alive today. And he wrote a book called Excusing Sinners, Blaming God. And it's a fantastic book. It's one of those books where it's like a breath of fresh air. Calvinism is attacked a lot because it's strong doctrine, and he tries to
Mm-hmm.
defend that head on. But other honorable mentions would be like William Lane Craig, who isn't a Calvinist, but his defense of Christianity and apologetics is
Mm-hmm.
so remarkable. I mean, he will go down in history as probably one of the most, probably up with Aquinas. I mean, he's that well known, he's that impactful to the Christian in today's day and age. William Lane Craig is. So I remember struggling over atheism for a time, and his videos, his writings, his books, his articles have really uh, shown a new light of Christianity that I haven't been shown before. So all those people, and there's plenty
Mm-hmm.
of others, but all those people have really impacted my worldview.
So all of yours are just religion based, faith based people. Nothing
Yeah,
outside of that.
I mean, you're not necessarily religion based. I mean, you're not a philosopher nor a theologian.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Are
but
you?
I mean, in one sense, anyone who does theology and philosophy is a philosopher and theologian. So I guess you
You know
are
what I
because you.
mean.
Um,
It's not my life goal though. I dabble. All
so
right.
I guess I would say yeah, pretty much. There's other
Okay.
influences, but those are the most important to me.
Gotcha. All right. So, um, obviously, my single greatest influence is Jesus. I'm just kidding. I mean, that's like pretty obvious, goes without saying. But I think like if I was legitimately like trying to answer that question as somebody who wasn't a Christian, like that would be my number one. Like Jesus and the New Testament authors, Paul, Peter, James, John, Matthew, all those guys. I mean, I've spent more time reading the Bible than any other book, and it's not even close. So my second would be Ralph Waldo Emerson, and particularly his essay called Self Reliance. He was an American philosopher and author that started the Transcendentalist movement. Um, I like this guy so much, I named my first son Emerson after him. Um, a lot of, at least well educated um, American, or I guess American high schoolers should know about him and should have studied him. But if not, I'll just give you some of the quotes. My favorite to kind of sum him up the most would probably be yourself, no base imitator of another, but your best self. There is something that you can do better than another. Listen to the inward voice and bravely obey that. Do the things at which you are great, not what you were never made for. So I think with that, when he says that you need to listen to your inward voice and bravely obey that, to me as a Christian, I would say sometimes that's the Holy Spirit. When you have thoughts of, I need to do this, I need to talk to this person, I need to call that person and hang out with them, or I need to, be of service to a stranger. It could be a million different things, but I've felt that inward voice a bunch of times in my life, and I tend to follow it, or at least I try to, and it usually leads to good things. Um, Another quote: "Nothing can bring you peace but yourself." So I mean, you can take that in a wrong way, but I think overall, don't look for your what is it called? When somebody's like approving of you, like don't look for approval from other people. Like you need to be okay with yourself most of all. Um, Also, whosoever would a man be must be a nonconformist. I like that one. Um, there's a bunch. Society is a wave. The wave moves onward, but the water of which it is composed does not. So it's just kind of this idea that society, it ebbs and flows. It's Trump, it's Biden, it's you know tyranny and socialist, and then it's all of these uh what are they called, conservatives and gun-toting righties. I mean, it's just the idea that society is constantly changing, and sometimes we're not aware of it while being inside of it. It could mean other stuff. I'm just kind of going through it off the top of my head. Another one of my favorite quotes: "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adorned by little statesmen and philosophers and divines." So, like a foolish consistency, he also talks about the ability to change your mind when you learn new information. Like, speak hard words what you believe today, and tomorrow speak even harder words for what you believe then. So, even as we're going through this and talking about this stuff and sharing our thoughts, these are things that I'll be very comfortable changing my mind on and saying something completely different, you know, a month from now if I learn that I found something that makes more sense to me, which is how it was. I was never a Calvinist. I argued against it vehemently at my time at Grace. There's a few kids there that were Calvinists that were constantly debating with, and I never agreed with them. And I spent many late nights arguing with them about it and why it doesn't make sense and all these other things. And then eventually, like the way Colton explained it to me, just made perfect sense, and now I accept it. So, um, I mean, I could go on forever, but I just believe if you're an American and you haven't read Self Reliance, you need to take some time out and read it. And not only read it, but you need to find someone to teach you that book, because it's not something that makes sense at first glance. At least it didn't for me when I was looking at it, as an 11th grader. But once you understand the meaning of what he's saying, like, it's incredible.
Yeah,
Um,
it's one of those. I just want to jump in real quick. It's one of
yeah,
those essays that is so fundamental to the American tradition that
it
pretty
is.
much all all major literary works draw on that one essay in some sense. And
Yep.
Daisy Miller,
Walt
Huck Finn,
Whitman.
Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson. I mean, Catcher in the Rye. They all draw on some sort of self-reliance, and that's really the American kind of soul.
It's the
As it were.
archetype. It's an American archetype.
It's my favorite quote from self-reliance is that for everything given, something is taken. It's always been to me impactful that you have to kind of judge how if you're going to give something, something's going to be taken away from you. And that's just what sacrifice is. It's life. So you have to be able to judge what is worthy
Worth
of
it.
being given. Yeah, what's worthy being given, what's worthy being taken. So it's very contemplative.
Yeah. Another guy that I've recently gotten into over the last year is Thomas Sowell. He is an American economist, but more than that, I think he has a lot of social commentary, especially around issues of race and the economy, obviously. But um, I don't really want to give his biography or whatever. Or at least what's important to me, is he was a Harvard educated black man from Harlem, that learned basically that after he graduated Harvard and started working in government jobs, he found out how awful and horrible the government was at doing anything that they were trying to accomplish. One of my favorite quotes from him is, "If the government was put in charge of the Sahara Desert, they would run out of sand." And it's not only funny, but I kind of believe it to be true. Um, I think the biggest thing I've taken away from him is kind of besides kind of a mistrust and I guess a healthy skepticism is what I would call it, of government and also people with Ivy League degrees and the highly educated people, the intellectual liberals of our society. Like, I kind of look at all of them with a healthy skepticism based off him. He said, like, the most valuable thing he learned at Harvard is that people who are Harvard educated aren't worth listening to. He's also said the road to hell is paved with Ivy League degrees. So he's a lot of funny sayings like that. I mean, just scroll through this guy's Twitter feed. It's chock full of little stuff like that. But I learned mostly from him, from his book. I don't want to get it wrong, but it's let me just look it up real quick. It's really fascinating. Discrimination and Disparities. It kind of goes through a history of different world economies, and it's almost based off of their natural formations that they have, kind of formed their economy and what they were able to do. Like the different civilizations in Africa had a really hard time getting together and trading with each other because they didn't have domesticated horses or animals that were large enough to traverse their massive land mass that they have. It's one of the, I think it is the biggest continent outside of Asia, and that's, I mean, you look at a map and it's actually a lot smaller on a map than it actually is. And he explains how because of that they weren't able to transfer goods across long areas of land, and they don't have a major river system that goes through the whole continent, so they couldn't use that. And the weather is so harsh there that it was really hard and expensive to move anything long distances. So he kind of uses that and explains why their economies had a really hard time going, and why the African economy went towards slavery eventually, because that was the only thing that they could do to make money on a large scale. Um, I'm really summing it up, and I might be doing an awful job, but he just kind of got me thinking of the world differently in a more educated light, I think. And along with him, I also read a lot and listened to a lot of Jordan Peterson. I know some people rolled their eyes, but I love Jordan Peterson. He's not, right on everything, but he's right on the important things, is how I would describe him. And with him, it's just the main idea of the world sucks, the world is awful, so you might as well do everything you can to make it a little bit better. Like, take on as much responsibility as you possibly can, bear it, and that is where you will find your purpose. And that was something I understood a little bit, but hearing him explain it that way, and now I'm able to kind of regurgitate it, and it's a very concise statement that I think should be, the goal of every citizen, every good citizen. Like, that should be the goal of what you're doing, is try to take on as much responsibility and make the world a better place and provide for the people you care about. Outside of that, not a whole lot matters. Few more here. Musically, I'm a huge music guy. I'm a musician. I've been playing music since Colton's dad taught me and gave me a guitar. Jack Johnson is kind of my first love, I guess, that I can remember, that I really got into on my own, and just his laid back style, while also having a lot of important and beautifully said criticisms of our society. Like, you don't know that he's trash talking you, but he is in a lot of his songs. Also, Kendrick Lamar is a huge one for me. I think he's by far the best artist that we have around nowadays. He is kind of more of a role model for me on how to produce and convey ideas that are not only impactful and deep and meaningful, but also could be popular music and is going to be sang by the masses. So not everyone's going to understand the meaning of the song, but it's going to reach more ears and more people are going to understand your message because of it. So he's just flat out incredible. I also grew up a little bit in Northo in some gang violence, and I've been around shootings and robberies and drive-bys, and I've been beaten up bricks thrown at me and all this other crap. So when he's talking about stuff like that, even though I am white, I kind of get it. And I haven't heard somebody describe it as well as it, or as in as much detail as he has. So I really like that. And then Mac Miller is just basically the soundtrack of my childhood. I don't love everything from him, but Best Day Ever, Blue Slide Park, and then a couple of his later albums, Circles and Swimming, are just stuff I listen to on repeat and have been, since I was 17 years old. Um, so, and I think the last thing I want to add is Jocko Willink. He has a podcast. He is an ex Navy SEAL commander for SEAL Teams Bruiser, or Task Force Bruiser, I should say. I'm not sure. It might have been SEAL Team 3 or 2. But he was active duty during the invasion of Iraq. And especially in the Battle of Ramadi is where he spent a good chunk of his deployment. The movie's American Sniper is made after a guy that was in his group and he was in charge of, and that happened while he was the commanding officer. So I mean, he's been in it and in it for a long time. And since he retired, he has this podcast that basically talks about leadership. He has a book called Extreme Ownership. Um, his podcast, I think it's just called the Jocko Willink Podcast, talks about military maneuvering, tactics, history, and he'll have vets come on there to talk about their experiences and stuff like that. So that's been really eye-opening. And along with him, I found this guy, Daryl Cooper, who is in charge of the Martyr Made podcast. And that guy pretty much just talks about the different atrocities throughout history that have happened, from the My Lai massacre. He talks about the Palestinian conflict and when it started way back in the early 1900s. He talked a huge series about Jim Jones, and how he came to notoriety, I guess, and how that whole thing happened. But he explains it in a way where you feel like you're actually there and you're weighing the options in your head, and kind of gives you like a first person view of these events. And I think throughout all of those two guys is where I've got my understanding that basically this world is a horrible mess and it can turn on you in a heartbeat. And like, the millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of people that have died that we don't even know about, never heard of, no government's going to admit it's happened, stuff like that. Just when you want to talk about human depravity and how far it goes, just listen to those guys for a little while and you'll start to get a clearer picture of what evil is. And just as a person, like, I want to know what evil is. I want to be able to look it in the eye, and I want to be able to see it in real time and hopefully, save myself from it if that ever, comes up in my life. And I don't think it will, but who really does until it's too late. So, that's depressing. But moving on, let's go to our next question. I want to know, Colton, what are your internal motivations? What draws you to act, to do stuff? I want to know about it.
That's a great question. Probably this idea of not being wrong, is one of the greatest, I think, internal motivations I have, is not being wrong. I grew up in a house where kids were just by default always wrong. So
Yeah.
this is pretty funny, but yeah. So I think this idea of wanting to know what truth is, wanting to know why it's important and how it can apply to our lives is something that's very, impactful to me. Something that's very, very defines why I do things, how I do it, and so forth. Uh, but this leads to a problem.
Mm.
So if any of the listeners know, but this leads to either one of two options: the Dunning-Kruger effect or the imposter syndrome. So if you have this internal motivation of not wanting to be wrong, it can really go either way. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is really just a hypothetical cognitive bias stating that people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability. So, um, uh, and I'm just reading it online, so I'll just read it again, is a
Mm-hmm.
hypothetical cognitive bias stating that people with low ability, with actual low ability or incompetence of a subject, the task, uh, overestimate their ability. So I'm a math teacher. So let's just say if I have a Dunning Kruger effect, I overestimate how well I can do math, because I want to be right, right? So I want to have the knowledge. So I can basically overestimate this fact that I'm actually know what I'm talking about when in reality, I really don't know what I'm talking about. So it can lead to this blind spot because of that internal motivation. The other horn of wanting to be right and wanting to not fail at being right or seeking truth is the imposter syndrome. So it's basically just the opposite. So again, I'm reading offline, but the imposter syndrome is loosely defined as doubting your abilities and feeling like a fraud. So disproportionately affects high achieving people who find it difficult to accept their accomplishments. So it's literally the opposite. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect is when you think of yourself as really competent, but really you're incompetent in a certain subject or task. The imposter syndrome is the opposite, and it says even though you are competent in a task, you think that you are incompetent. So this idea of kind of bouncing back and forth between the imposter syndrome, feeling as if I'm incompetent, even though I am competent. I've studied it a lot. Let's just say math. I've taught it for a while. I know the very basics of what it means to do a derivative in calculus or
Mm-hmm.
trigonometric equations or blah blah blah. But sometimes I feel like I'm just it's not good enough. So therefore, it's the imposter syndrome. And actually, funny story, real quick. A
Mm-hmm.
student actually told me that he thinks I suffer from imposter syndrome, and he said it really nice. It wasn't like it wasn't like a jab, like "f you, Mr. Carlson." But it was more like, "Hey, I just want you to be aware because I love you and you're a great teacher, and so I hope this doesn't like damage you so much." And I was actually very appreciative. He was one of my philosophy students. I still talk to him to this day. So and then the other side, of course, is like I said, the Dunning Kruger effect, where I think that I've done so much in my lifetime. I'm a math teacher. Of course, I know I have a degree. Of course, I know what I'm talking about when I may not, right? I may actually not know what I'm talking about. I may still be explaining things wrong. So, this idea, this internal motivation of wanting to be right and not necessarily failing in your pursuit of knowledge and theology and philosophy and blah, 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 could ultimately go one of those two ways. And I think the Spirit of God uh, helps us, or at least helps me, and as does my wife, kind of keep track, keep on the middle ground. That,
Mm-hmm.
listen, yes, you have to be humble in your studies, but that doesn't mean you have to sacrifice confidence or sacrifice assurance in some way, right? And I think you would agree.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my basic internal motivation and the struggles that I have when approaching, new topics.
So ultimately, the motivation is to find truth. Like overall, I think that that's been something you've been striving for a really long time, probably as long as you can remember. So your relationship to that is over prepared and feeling incompetent or under compared but feeling competent. It's just where are you at on that line about this issue today? It's kind of something you're
And
always thinking about.
what helps me is to know that Jesus is the truth. I mean, I
Yeah.
have it tattooed. I don't know if you can see it tattooed on my
Yeah.
arm. It's Latin. It's literally what is truth. Um, and then underneath it's Roman numerals for John 14:6. So understanding that it's not necessarily we're seeking what is true, but we're seeking a person
Mm-hmm.
who is truth. We're seeking Christ. He is the truth of the matter. And so that really governs, helps my soul keep on the middle ground instead of kind of fluctuating between those two horns.
Yeah. So on this topic, I had a lot more to say. Um, so I think my biggest overall motivation is a need to feel unique. And I think that that pretty much started with my first name being Shemez. And if you don't know, my middle name is Blaze. So I just have a very unique name, but there's nothing particularly unique about me. I would say that to myself, but others maybe would say otherwise. Um, but with that, like, I feel like my views on almost everything can't really be mainstream at all. Um, like politically, I'm very nuanced, sort of an extreme libertarian. And with social issues, I'm very I have differing opinions based on what we're talking about, and it's never going to be something you really heard before. And I, to a fault, sometimes I feel like I need to look at all ideas and all problems and think about them and internalize them in my own way and make sense of it in myself and not really take what other people have said before me really that seriously. And that's part of, my Ralph Waldo Emerson influence creeping in. But it's also just I want to be unique. Like even look at, my hair right now. Like there's no reason my hair should be this long, but I want to do it because I want to, I feel better when I look different even. It's kind of stupid, but it is what it is. That's what you get for having a name like Shemez and looking like I do. Um, I also feel a need to be heard and respected. And I think this is kind of true for me and Colton. We both kind of want this. I probably want it a lot more though, because growing up, um, I think both of our parents kind of told us, like, shut up, don't say anything. Whatever you say is not that important. Like Colton's dad always said, children are to be seen, not heard. And my parents would just tell me every time I asked them a question that I was being disrespectful. And so, with that, I was never granted an audience by my parents to kind of think things through or ask them about my ideas. And even in our church with theological ideas, we weren't really granted an audience with that either. It was kind of just, that's something, I want to really get into with you. It's something I heard a lot. So now, I want people to listen to me when I have something to say, and that's not like forcing people to. It's making sure that I actually do have something important to say. It's making sure that the quality of what I'm saying is worth listening to, and I spend a lot of time making sure that that's the case, and then wanting to be respected. It's not demanding respect from the people around me. It's building myself up as a person, a useful person, so that people around me will just respect me naturally. Like I do this a lot with work scenarios where I get in there, I work super hard, I learn as much as I possibly can, I pick everyone's brain. And that's not because I want to necessarily be a great employee, although that's part of it. It's mostly because when I do have something to say, I want people to take me seriously. So I like overwork myself. I overanalyze and overexplain myself sometimes. Um, and I think these are all kind of connected, but I think the third part of it is very open and honest, painfully so. I, I don't keep secrets about anything. Um, I don't mind talking about my own insecurities. I don't mind being vulnerable. Just last week, I was started the service off pretty much crying my eyes out talking about Father's Day and how like I didn't have an earthly father, but I felt like I had a heavenly father. And I capped it off just by explaining like fathers don't underestimate the influence you have on your children. Because my half brother was influenced by his dad very negatively. Um, and I was influenced, I would say, by my heavenly father very positively. In that, as an earthly father, like you want to emulate Christ and be more like that because your children are going to follow in your footsteps. That doesn't mean they're going to be a Christian, but they're at least going to be wise people. And I had some verses in there too, and I was struggling to get through it. And it was interesting, but that's kind of what I do. Like I don't really care. Like this is who I am. Take it or leave it. And because I like sharing my opinions and sharing myself too, like I really don't mind being wrong. I don't mind being told I'm an idiot because I find myself being an idiot probably a lot more than other people do. So I'm going to say dumb stuff. I'm going to say dumb stuff on this podcast and I'll change my mind about it later or clarify later. And I'm completely okay with that. It's fine with me. I don't really care. Um, so I think, oh, the last one is just security and community. Like I want to build a close family unit, to have close friends, to be somebody that other people can rely on. And I also rely on other people a lot too. So, I mean, I've had the same like five friends for the last like 15 years and it hasn't changed. But that's because we have a really strong community together, really strong relationships. So I think that's just because I know what it feels like to be left out and what it means when you don't have security and when you don't have a community. And I understand how much it sucks. So I try to, save myself from feeling like that ever again as part of it. And that could be a positive or negative thing. Um, Next question sort of goes along with what Colton explained with his pursuit of truth. So I want to know, Colton, what is your moral dilemma? Like, what bothers you most about this world that you want to fix?
Um, so many things bother me.
Yeah,
Many things keep me up at night. So, if any of the listeners aren't familiar with the Enneagram, kind of a personalities test. It's honestly basically like pseudoscience, like kind of psychology, but it's made from Christians, but by no means is it a Christian personality test. It just kind of mirrors something similar to the Myers-Briggs test, 16 personality tests, and so forth. So when I took the test, I got a number one. So there's 1 through 9, numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And I got
that's what
number
that
one.
means.
And yeah. One is the reformer. So reformer just means you are like an advocate for change in the world. Um, that's probably the best I can explain it. So you see the world, you see that bothers you, and you want to change it. So getting a one and being kind of a reformer, my wife jokes at me all the time. That's such a one thing to say. When I say something like that guy didn't have his blinker on, or that guy's jaywalking or something like that, when it's not supposed to be. So this idea of my motivation of overcoming hardship and difficulty and seeking truth and not being, not being really a failure, um, and being afraid, honestly, of being wrong. That's a very difficult thing because as a reformer, I don't want things be wrong. I want them to be right. I want them to be right the first time.
Hmm.
And it's this idea of this biblical idea of shalom. Oh, it's really a Jewish idea, but it's found throughout the Old Testament. Basically meaning peace, but even a more deeper sense of what it means. It really means the way things ought to be. So this idea of shalom, like God wanted the world to be shalom, but and we're going to get into this in the next episode, was the garden really shalom?
Yeah.
Was that really what God wanted it to be? Was that how it was supposed to be in the garden? uh, I and we'll get into the next episode, but I tend to think that after redemption is complete and our glorification process is finalized within us in heaven for eternity, that shalom. That is the way things ought to be. So I'm trying to fight against, as best as I can, about this idea of why this and why that, specifically over the areas of philosophy. So questions that haunt me, and I'm using haunt in a loose sense, but that haunt me, that keep me up at night, is where did sin come from? Like, why is there sin? Was Adam created perfect or imperfect? if he was created perfect, then how could he fall? And if he was created imperfect, then why did a perfect God create an imperfect being? Would not God be ultimately responsible for the fall then? I
Yeah.
mean, these questions are myriad. I mean, they can keep going on and on and on. And hopefully, in the next coming episodes, we'll try to dive deep into these questions, like where did sin come from? Why is there sin? Is God responsible for creating the fall, even though he may have known that Adam would have sinned, and so forth? Those are just a selection of a couple questions that haunt me, that keep me up at night.
Yeah.
Most importantly, I think, based on my personality, my struggles, hardships, the Dunning Kruger effect, and the imposter syndrome, wanting to be right, uh, trying to grasp the idea in the gospel is so difficult for me because I bounce between works and just grace.
Mm-hmm.
And I know some people don't necessarily struggle with this. Like they just hear the gospel once and like, oh, it's of grace, no works. Oh, that's fantastic. Praise God. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. You're telling me I don't do anything. So this idea that grace literally requires nothing of me
Mm-hmm.
is perhaps one of the most mind-boggling things to me, but at the same time, one of the most liberating, spiritually fulfilling things I can ever come like try to wrestle with. That grace requires nothing. It's I'm already accepted in the eyes of God. I was called by God before the foundation of the world. I was chosen, I was redeemed, I was regenerated, and I will be glorified in the last day. And nothing I did deserve that. It's completely unconditional. That is beautiful. It just brings me to my knees in repentance and faith and worship, and that is something that I personally struggle with the most. That would be probably my moral dilemma,
Yeah.
if you want to call it that.
For me, it's really hard to answer because I don't have that same like overall summed up view on life, I suppose, or a clarity on what I want to fix or what I want to do exactly.
Mm.
Because I feel like a lot of my life up to this point has just been about survival to an extent. Um, and that might sound melodramatic, but it it has been that way for me. As a young kid through foster care, and then as a kid in foster care living in ortho, and then as a kid growing up around semi-abusive parents, um, and then the death of my birth mother, and then my brother leaving me and my foster sister having to get two liver transplants, to a big breakup in my beginning of college, which kind of had my world that I thought I was building for myself fall apart, to now being married and starting to build a family. And I finally feel like the last couple of years that I'm getting out of this survival mode a little bit, and I'm starting to think about life more than just get through the next day type of thing. And also a huge part of that too was being sick with what I had. It was complex regional pain syndrome, and it's something I still deal with, but not to the effect that I had when it first started. But I mean, that disease has like a 90% suicide rate, because the pain is just so overwhelming, and it I can't describe to you how awful that was, and sometimes still is to go through. You can look it up if you care to, but it's just massive, inexplainable pain and there's nothing you can do to fix it really. You just kind of have to wait it out. So that health problem's been going on for a while too. So that pretty much makes it. It's so hard to think about things on a grand scale because of that. And I don't want people to feel sorry for me. It's just I was trying to think of why I don't have that same motivation that Colton does, and I think that that's part of it. And also part of it is just I have a strong belief that God has something that he wants me to do, some type of job. It could just be a single conversation with a stranger. It could mean just raising my children right and having them be good examples for others, being a good example myself. It could be that I go on to be a super famous podcaster with my good friend Colton, and Christianity skyrockets. We have a giant revival in America, or a giant revival somewhere in the world due to us. I don't know what it is. I have no idea. But I believe that there's something there for me. And I guess my moral dilemma is just trying to figure out what that is, honestly. I've tried a lot of different stuff. I've tried music. I've tried streaming on Twitch, as ridiculous as that sounds. And now I'm trying this, and I'm just, what can I do to set myself up to do what God wants me to do? And I'm still trying to figure that out. So I don't have a great answer to that. So we are just going to move on to our last question. And I want to preface this question with a quote from Jordan Peterson. It's kind of a long quote, but it's full of wisdom, and it's a very interesting thought that I haven't really considered before. But I want it to be the whole what do you call it, purpose of this episode was to pretty much explain our deficiencies that are brought to light with this question. So I'm just going to read it. To master a body of thought, once that body of thought has been deemed valuable, is to stake a claim to competence within its hierarchy. I believe this to be an observation of the utmost significance. It helps explain why people become so committed to their beliefs and why they are so motivated to ignore evidence to the contrary. It is not merely a psychological theory. If I am the master of a communist doctrine in a communist state, then I can take a position of privilege in the social hierarchy, commensurate with that mastery. It is that position which provides me with status security, and by security I mean freedom from privation and uncertainty, and therefore pain and anxiety, as well as an opportunity and hope. This in large part is provided by the society surrounding me. It is not so much that my arbitrary beliefs explain the world and therefore keep me safe and hopeful. Truly functional beliefs, which, and when enacted, soon produce the results desired, and that's to do that job. The function of an ideological belief in regulating emotion and motivation is more indirect. First, we must keep in mind the realization of my social positioning regulates my emotions, keeping me from despair, making the present welcoming, and brightening the future. Furthermore, it has the validity of my claim to knowledge as defined by the hierarchy I occupy, that it provides me with moral justification for the status I've been granted. If that claim is undermined proximally by a critic of my mastery, or worse, distally, by a critic of the belief system that is attendant hierarchy as such, then I lose my moral claim to the status, security, and hope to which my social position has provided me. That not only enables a given particular challenger the opportunity to make a claim to all that I've surrounded myself with, but risks exposing me to all the fear, uncertainty, and anger, all the unbearable dysregulation of my motivations and emotions that my potential loss of position would entail. This might include a loss of faith of those surrounding me societally, and a potential devastating practical consequence of that, but also equally terrifying psychological possibility of losing belief in myself. That's a handful. But there are beliefs that we hold on to that would devastate our world if they were kind of snatched from us. And I think first and foremost, and pretty obviously, our belief in Christ and our, Christianity is what would utterly destroy our worlds. But part of what we've explained in this episode too is the other things that would, kind of make us reconsider everything. So for me, if I lost the security and sense of community that I've been trying to build for myself, like if my wife left me or if my friends stopped talking to me, if I felt or finally realized, probably more accurately, that I wasn't unique. I'm just like everybody else. I have nothing special to offer. That would be devastating to me, personally. And you could go down the list of things that we mentioned. If Colton, finally realized that, dude, you're wrong. You're never going to be right. Everything that you're saying doesn't make sense. You don't really have skills. You're never going to answer these questions. Like, that would be devastating to him. So we're trying to explain, what beliefs we probably hold too tightly to. Um, so I guess to sum it up, what personal ties do we have to our views that we've expressed already? Colin, go ahead.
So Calvinism is a big part of my life. I'm currently trying to write a book, trying to defend it. So it's in a weird angle, but still trying to defend it nonetheless. It's a big part of my life, specifically because it's a big part of my sanctification. In college, a view of salvation, and specifically sanctification, and the freedom and grace that is paired with that in order to overcome sin drastically changed because of something like Calvinism. The power of God and the gospel and the way it was preached and taught, the emphasis was completely on God and not necessarily on man. And it just really showed me a different path of Christian living than I was used to. I think if that kind of, if that was taken away, let's just say, if Calvinism was taken away from me and it was actually false, I wouldn't stop becoming a Christian, but I would have to rethink how sanctification is done. Um, it may be the same way it is right now for me when I overcome sin and try to ask God for forgiveness and repent over certain sins. It probably is going to be the exact same, but it would be almost as if a hole is there. That's one thing that I can think of. It's this kind of like lost cost bias that I think we have to be careful of, at least for me. And that I have this that I have lost this sort of power overcoming sin in my life through Calvinism, if it were shown to be false. This idea of power through the Calvinistic gospel, or how Calvinism represents the gospel, I think would be very damaging to, not necessarily, like I said, my faith, but damaging to how I um, pray, I suppose, how I relate to Christ and the Spirit, um, and how they relate to me through the sanctification process. I think that is one thing that is is my personal tie. I think that's something I'm well aware of, and that I want to continue to be aware of. But it is a personal tie that perhaps even a confirmation bias of some sort that I need to always um, be cognizant of, cognizant of.
Be aware of it.
Yeah.
Just be aware of it. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time and effort into not having these. Even before I read that quote, it was always on the forefront of my mind that I would be willing to rearrange my worldview depending on what new knowledge I've received. And that's going back to when I was a child reading, Proverbs and the story of Solomon. That was something that I asked for and prayed about all the time, was for God to give me wisdom. And I found that the older I got, what that really means is that me just finding out how much of an idiot I am and how much I don't know, and even my best guess or even my best work isn't that great. So I loosely hold on to all of my beliefs outside of my faith in Jesus. Um, I I mean, I'm basically saying that I don't deal with this, but I know I do. Like I said, um if basically all this that I was doing to be unique, to be respected, to feel secure, to be open with people. If I ever came to the honest and internal feeling that I wasn't accomplishing any of that, that would be devastating to me. Like I mentioned before, if I finally realized that I wasn't unique, and I finally realized I have nothing important to say, I have, I'll never be anything like Kendrick Lamar. I'll never be able to express myself in a way that people want to listen to. And a lot of my experience, at least so far in life, has kind of felt like that. A lot of the things I've tried to do have failed, but I haven't given up yet. So I think part of what we're doing here is, again, that internal motivation to try to feel respected and heard and unique. So I guess I'm holding on to the belief that there's some value here that I think is worth sharing with other people. And, we might find out that it's a whole bunch of crap. And both of us are going to have to go reconsider a lot of stuff. But I'd like to say that we're both willing to do that. And we're both willing to swallow that pill if that time comes. So, with that, we are going to wrap up our episode 1. And I don't know where this is going to be uploaded. Probably YouTube. I'll try to get it on Google Podcasts or Apple Podcasts, although I don't really know how to do that. But we'll get it out somewhere for you guys. And if you listened all the way through, I appreciate it. And if not, I totally understand. But the next episode, we're not talking about ourselves. We're getting right into the ideas and philosophies that we've been, working on and building for the last couple months. And that'll be, I think, a lot more interesting listen for most people. So see you guys later.